Good morning, everyone. My name is Lorene Watts, and I'm the Operations Manager and HR Specialist at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the Chamber, welcome to day one of our Women's Network Annual Pinnacle Awards. I have the honor of introducing our incredible guest speaker for today's workshop, Lift as You Climb, Intersectionality at Work. Jackie Glenn is the CEO of Glenn Diversity, Inclusion, and HR Solutions. She started her career in human resources at EMC Corporation in 2000 and quickly realized her purpose and passion as a Jamaican immigrant in America for creating corporate environments that reflect the diverse world that companies like EMC and others are aiming to serve. Just so that we can maximize our conversation time, you can find her full bio below the video stream on this page. Before we jump in, I encourage you all to submit your questions throughout the workshop using the feature on the right-hand side of your screen, as we'll be setting aside some time at the end of the presentation for audience Q&A. Also, please utilize the chat feature to share your stories, your ideas, and experiences with each other. Note that this program is being recorded and will be posted to the Chamber's YouTube page a week from today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor, privilege, and a pleasure to be bringing this workshop to you today, Lift as You Climb, the Intersectionality at Work. And so we're gonna dive right in, and I always like to give kudos to someone who is near and dear to my heart. So I have someone that, I might call her name Monique, but Monique, let's proceed to the first slide. So I always like to start my presentation out with a quote. And so linkage, I have this quote. It says, organizations that don't consider the role of intersectionality plays in the advancement of women leaders are missing the big picture. And this quote is so key for what we're gonna talk about today. So if you're in an organization and they don't consider the role of intersectionality, big picture, they're missing it. So we're gonna dive right in. Monique, let's go to the next slide. So I always like to put this picture up of myself because when I'm presenting, I find it easier to use myself as a guinea pig or as a model around intersectionality and identity. So who I am, of course, Lauren did a great job introducing me, Jackie Glenn, but I'm not just Jackie Glenn. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. I'm an immigrant. I hail from the sunny island of Jamaica. I'm an author of the book, Lift as I Climb, an immigrant girl's journey through corporate America. I'm a mom, practitioner, a partner, a wife, I should say, about me and my intersectionality and identity, that when you look at me, you won't see all of these. And that's what intersectionality is about. Let's move to the next slide. So to break it down a bit, sometimes people interchange intersectionality and identity. But for those of you who are really looking to that makes up a person. So remember what I just say about me, the intersectionality. I'm not just a tall Black woman with an accent, which a lot of people in corporate America would refer to me as when they forget my name. I am a mother, a partner, a sister. That's intersectionality. Identity is how we see ourselves and how others see us. So I see myself as an empathetical person, a warrior in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I see myself as a woman of God, a Christian, and that is my identity. But how others see me might be totally different. They might see me as a strong person, a Black woman, an African-American woman. They might see me as, when I was in corporate America, people always say, you're so intimidating. And people always say that about me, and I'm not sure how to take that. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? But where I am right now, in terms of my identity, I take that as a good thing. And so intersectionality, know what your intersectionality is and your identity. Let's move to the next slide. So look at this. My intersectionality give me a unique perspective. So when I was in corporate America and I would happen to be the only woman at the table and the only Black woman at the table, that gave me a unique perspective because nobody had the perspective that I brought to the table. So I'd like to give everyone who is listening to me today on this call to, when you go home this weekend, build something like this. Get a beautiful picture of yourself and build out your, I call this my intersectionality chart. It's not all inclusive. There's a few things missing, but as an example, what you may see or hear of me. So you can hear me speaking and you can hear that accents in my voice. Some people hear the accent, some people don't, but I would say to you, it's there. I'm a woman of color. I'm an extrovert. You can tell. I love people. I love talking, sometimes too much. Sometimes my granddaughter would say to me, Grandma, stop talking every day. I am tall, which you can't tell right now because I'm on Zoom. I have natural hair. I'm a woman in tech and DEI, and I have an accent. So what you see or what you hear, you can see some of those. But look at what you may not see. I have a disability. I am a baby boomer. I'm an immigrant. Now, if I didn't tell you, you could guess that. I'm a mom, a grandmother, a sister. I'm a business owner. And so there is so much more that about me, but I always say to people, I am more than what's beneath the eye. I'm more than you see. And none of us are just one thing. So when you go into an organization, you have to bring all of you into the workplace, and employer has to embrace all of our intersectionality and survive in corporate America. And if we have time, I'll talk a little bit how I brought my accent and all into the workplace, even though at a younger age, it wasn't something that I love about myself, but it's grown on me and I've used it as a brand differentiator. So let's move to the next slide. So I wanted to spend some time today talking about my career roadmap, because if you think of the title, it really is about how do you bring your intersectional, all of you, into the workforce and still be successful at what you do, not having to code switch. For some of you know that, going as, one thing, you're one thing at home and you're another thing when you go into the organization, or you're one thing when you're home running your business, but when you go in front of a client, you sound different and you're something different. That's called code switching. Like I would say to Lauren, hey, Lauren, how you doing, girl? And then I get into the office and I see Lauren and I said, hello, Lauren, how are you doing today? That is code switching. And so I listened to an interview that Denzel Washington did, and he talked about the 4 quadrants of our life. And I want to take you briefly through some of the quadrants of my life. I have 5 on here because I always like to be different. But the first quadrant, if you're listening to me today and you're just a year or so out of school, you're just starting your career, and you're new to your organization or you're new to work, that's your big move. You've moved from being a student into corporate America or into an organization. So you've made that big move. For me, my big move was moving to the United States from Jamaica. That was a huge move for me, because not only was I leaving an island to come to the US, but I was going to the Midwest, to a town in Kansas called Shawnee Mission. So if you read my book, Lift That I Climb, I came to this country as a nanny and worked in the Midwest for 2 years, moved to Boston, and my first job was at Beth Israel, now Beth Israel Lehi, where I work as a unit clerk. So that was my big move. And I want to say one more thing about the quadrant. The quadrants are not by months or by year. These could be a couple of years my first quadrant was about 4 or 5 years, maybe even up to 10 years. Your second quadrant in life is when you're really entering your professional journey, because you might come out of school, take a job just to get your foot in the door, quadrant 1. Quadrant 2 is where your professional journey begins. I got promoted as a medical transcriptionist. I re-enrolled back in school. I started at Bunker Hill, went to Emmanuel College to finish my 4-year degree, completed my undergrad, obtained my first HR position, became a wife and a mother, and while I was a full-time student. So don't tell me you can't do all of this, because it can be done. Serve as both a mentor and a mentee. So I started mentoring and being a mentee at my second quadrant. Your third quadrant is really when you're really in your profession, you're growing, you're thriving. I got promoted to HR and a people manager, so I started managing people. I joined a professional not-for-profit board, and I completed my graduate degree. And there's a reason for this, how you bring all of your intersectionality to the workplace. Because what I didn't tell you in my first quadrant, I'm double backing a bit. I worked at a hospital as a unit clerk, and as an immigrant, one of my biggest stumbling block was people understanding me. And I cannot tell you how many times people would ask me, what did you say? And so I knew that I had to figure out how to slow down. And I also had to encourage my colleagues at work to activate their listening skill. Because if you're working with someone with an accent, there's give on both sides. You're activating your listening skill, and I am slowing down. So back to quadrant 3, that's where I completed my graduate degree at Lesley University, developed more professional skill, and got promoted to a director level. And then quadrant 4, which I'm quasi in and out of, is where was my next chapter. So I started quadrant 4, promoted as a chief diversity officer and a vice president, which I did for almost 20 years. I did that, retired out of corporate America, or I want to say failed retirement, but left corporate America, wrote and published my first book, launched my own business. That's all happening in the last, I was always a speaker, coach, advocate, and then I continue my board work. And so this is a way of you using your identity and really mapping out where you are. What quadrant are you in? You need to ask yourself, and where do I see myself growing? And as you build, I encourage you to build out your quadrant. And even if you can't populate it now, you can aspire to be things and have it in those quadrants. I have quadrant 5 on there, which is now, I'm doing some of the same things in quadrant 4, but I'm also adding new things like spending more time with my grandchildren and doing things that we've never done before. And so a lot more flexibility in quadrant 5 and 4. And this is where you get to a point in your career where you are absolutely in charge of where you want it to go. And so let's go to the next slide, because I want to make sure that I use the time effectively. So intersectionality in the workplace. You know, there's a lot of barriers, but I want to point out 4. And I got this from a survey that was just done by, who did this survey? I think it was Oliver Wyatt that did this survey, and they surveyed women in the workplace and what was some of the obstacles, Oliver Wyman, what were some of the obstacles that was holding them back? And they found 4 barriers for women seeking leadership. And number 1, and the first one was leadership is the same game with different rules for women. And what do I mean by that? The survey talked about what women, when surveyed, said was one of their key skill set in leadership. And they asked men what was their key skill set that they need to be a leader. Only one thing was the same for both men and women out of the 4, and it was confidence. Both men and women agree that confidence was important in leadership. Everything else was different. Women thought empathy, collaboration, and men said decisiveness, decision-making, and get it done. And so a lot of time we are being evaluated as women leaders through the lens of men and what they think is the way to be a great leader. And that's where it comes in, where leadership is the same game with different rules. Because if you're evaluating me on the rules that you evaluate a man on, that might not be good for me, because those are not what some of the things that I hold near and dear to my heart or believe is important in a leadership role. And as we talk about that, we move right into two, where results don't speak for themselves. Because if you're evaluating me on a set of results and I am doing something else, that my results might not speak for for what I'm doing. And a lot of time, women doesn't, we don't speak up, we don't toot our own horn. I'm really a big believer, and we're not one to really advertise our wins. And so, the leadership is the same game, different result, but also results. Different rule, results don't speak for themselves. So even if the results are there, that we have collaborated, we've gotten a project done, but if that's not what they're golding us from or grading us on, it will not speak for itself. And then right into qualified women are unintentionally, or just to be transparent, intentionally left on the sideline. We could spend the entire workshop talking about women that I've spoken to myself who have been unintentionally sometimes, but sometimes intentionally left on the sideline because they're being graded or rated or evaluated with a different set of lens and not the lens that we are good at. And so the fourth one is really, they all ties in together, because if qualified women are being left on the sideline, a lot of this play into implicit, I like to say conscious and unconscious bias and microaggression. And when you put all of these together, not playing, being graded with the same rule, our results not showing up and speaking for ourselves, unintentionally or intentionally left on the sideline, a lot of that comes out as is implicit bias and microaggression, and it's exhausting. And so today, before I leave, and I know I'm almost coming down to the wire, but I have a few more minutes, I really want to talk a little bit about how bias shows up and microaggression and how exhausting it can be, and what are some of the gifts I can give you to come back and mitigate bias and microaggression in the workplace. Let's move to the next slide. So imposter syndrome affects 70% of women and people of color. 70, not 7. I always like, and it really is the belief that you are an inadequate and incompetent failure, despite evidence. And I always like to exaggerate the evidence that indicates that you are skilled and quite successful. And so a lot of the different lens that you are being evaluated can really erode your confidence. And so I have a few gifts here for you today, but imposter syndrome is real. And one of the things that you have to remember is to remind yourself of your skill set, your accomplishment, who you are, your intersectionality, and that you don't really have to do it like everybody else. I was just reading an article by a friend of mine, and he was saying that, he always felt like he had to be like the other executives. And when he realized he could bring his accent to the boardroom and not try to be like his white counterpart in the boardroom, that's when he felt like he had met it. So imposter syndrome is the belief that you're inadequate. And the way that you do that is continuing to learn, grow, and embracing all of your intersectionality. Let's go to the next slide. So I spoke about my book, Lift as I Climb, and that was the impetus of the title of this this workshop. And I really changed the I to you, because I want everyone to be lifting as you climb. And that word climb, it doesn't mean it has to be an upward climb. It can be a climb that you're moving sideways, but you're climbing, you're moving, you're not staying static. The impetus and the title of this book came from being in corporate America and just looking at women who had made it to the top and didn't look back and lift someone up. It happened over and over and over again. And especially as a woman of color, what I found was sameness was rooted. And when we did look back, when a woman did look back, they would lift another woman that looked like them and not necessarily a person of color. And so I always vowed that I would continue to lift as I climb, even if I was just moving sideways. So I really believe if you get nothing out of this, you really want to make sure that you're looking back and you're lifting that sister up and that or that brother or that young person up. I wrote this book and I really wanted people to rest assured that you can make it. I came here as a nanny and I rose to the level of CDO. The book is a quick read, it's 10 chapters, and the words that I have coined, my gems, are authenticity, self-awareness, boldness, responsibility, faith, empathy, flexibility, integrity, resilience, and trust. Okay, why these words, Jackie? Because these were the words I grew up on in Jamaica. These was the word my mom always instilled in me. And although my mom is not here any longer on this earth, I really continued to use this word and found myself using them throughout my journey in corporate America. And so I have some gift for you, because as you continue to embrace your identity and your intersectionality, I would like to give you with a few gifts. Let's move on to the next slide. So the first gift I'd like to give you, the first gem, is the gem of boldness. Oprah Winfrey said, unless you choose to do something great with it, it makes no difference how much you are rewarded or how much power you have. So you can't, your boldness, you can have boldness, but if you don't do anything with it, it doesn't make any difference. And so here are some tips as I give you the boldness gem that I want you to hang on to and keep in your jeweler box, because they are gems. Exhibit boldness and confidence requires bravery. I worked in an organization where I was an anomaly. And every time I would go into a room, I would be the only one. And so this gem came with me every time I went in. And boldness sometimes can be misconstrued or misinterpreted as cockiness. But you really have to go in if you want to sit at the table and you want to be heard with this boldness gem. Make sure that you suspend all judgment and assume positive intent. So when I go in with my boldness gem, I don't go in thinking, oh, people are going to think I'm cocky. People are going to think, they don't understand me. People are going to think I'm not really qualified to be in the room. I go boldly. I go in thinking I belong there, and what I have to say need to be here. Know your craft, own your craft, practice make perfect. For you to exhibit this gem, I'm a firm believer in practice make perfect. Be prepared, be prepared, be prepared. And I always at all time, and not everybody can do this, but I love to add a little humor. Sometimes when you're in a room or on Zoom now these days, and you're a little nervous, just throw out a little humor. It will lighten you up, it will lighten your audience up, and it will get your boldness, juice, and gem flowing. My second gift for you is the gift of resilience. Resilience, especially now, but I always give the gift of resilience to women. I think it's important that we give it to our daughters, we give it to our granddaughter, and we keep it for ourselves. So this is a gem that is going to be re-gift all over again, time and time again. Margaret Thatcher said, you have to fight a battle more than once to win it. And I love, love, love that quote, because we are so inclined to give up, especially as women. I cannot begin to tell you how many times people have come to me and said, I applied for a job, I didn't get it, someone less qualified get it. And I said, what did you do? And they said, nothing. I'm so tired. No, hang in there. Get comfortable with growing, stretching, and demonstrating resilience in thoughts and idea. Go for it again and again and again. Being resilient requires that you know your facts and do your research. And so if you're in a role and you're not getting promoted, you feel like you're underpaid, do your research. I told someone yesterday, go to HR and ask HR to do a compensation review and see where you are. Resilience is the ability to stay put, to sit when it doesn't feel good. When you read my book, I talk about that. You have to stay uncomfortable sometimes. Resilience. And I put this last bullet point because someone asked me the other day, well, what if it's affecting your health? If it's affecting your health and wellness, then you need to step away from it. But sometimes just when you're in the midst of giving up and throwing in the towel, you have a breakthrough. And I always tell my daughters that, you know, it's in the midst of your resilience when you come to the end and you've succeeded that you can go back. And I always say good books, good movies, and you can coach someone about when you were in that situation, how you got out of it, and what are some of the tools you use. If you give up, throw the towel in, don't fight, you will never be able, and you'll always ask yourself, what would have happened if I sit in? If you read my book, I talk about some of the experience in corporate America and what I did. I use my boldness gem. I use my resilience gem. And those gems are so overused, but they're gems. And so they never go out of style, and they really keep their shininess about them. So the gift of resilience is to really make sure you stay put, even in the midst when it doesn't feel good and you want to just throw in the towel. So let's move to the next slide, because I think I'm coming up on time, and I hope you're putting some questions out and you have some questions for me. Okay, here are some takeaways, and I love quotes. You've probably figured that out throughout this presentation. But Michelle Obama said, if you want people to trust you, then you have to be trustworthy. Trust is big. As you look at your identity and your intersectionality, one of the things that I always say, you want to make sure people, when people are talking about you and you're not in the room, they're saying you're trustworthy. They're saying, you know, you bring a sense of boldness to everything that you do, that you exhibit resilient. You don't ever want to have this, what was I going to say? This name of not being trustworthy and people can't trust you, because if you're not trustworthy and you cannot be trusted, no one is going to endorse you. Effective communication is non-negotiable. I always ask people, what did you say? What did you do? Did you send a note? Did you ask? And no, I didn't do anything. No one, we're not mind readers. If there's something going on at work, the first thing you do is try to make sure you communicate either written or verbally. The third one here is letting your audio match your video. It's really, without credibility, it is difficult to motivate others to listen or follow you. So there are people that will talk a lot, or as my mom always say, talk a good game and do nothing. Let your audio match your video. And this is my sister's little saying, and I stole it from her because I just love it. You know, you gotta do what you say you're gonna do. And if you say you're gonna do it, you have to do it. And then the last one, which they're all my favorite, is a pearl is worthless as long as it's in its shell. And so with all our intersectionality, you have to come out of your shell. You have to be bold, you have to be resilient, or else it will be worthless. And so today I bring to you all of these, and I hope you'll embrace the gem. They're not neatly packaged for you. And we'll move to the next slide, and I'll end again, of course, with another quote. Kimberly Crenshaw said, if we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. So if we're not intersectional, some of us will get lost. So I'd like to end on, we welcome all race and ethnicity, all religion, all countries of origin, all gender identity, all sexual orientation, all abilities and disability, all spoken languages, all ages, everyone. We stand here with you and you are safe here. So let your identity and your intersectionality flow. Now I'm gonna turn it back over to Lauren because I think I am right at time. Lauren, thank you everyone.
Excellent.
For some Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jackie, for sharing your gems and words of wisdom with us all at a time when in the world, top of mind for everyone is diversity and inclusivity, and figuring out intersectionality and understanding your true identity and who you are. We are all so appreciative to be able to hear and learn from you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. So if you guys haven't already, please feel free to plug in questions in the chat. We want to hear from you. I've already got some really great ones going. So just to kind of dive in, first question from someone in the audience. How can women of color gain confidence in their abilities despite the bias that exists in different workplaces?
You know, I always say you have to know who you are and embrace all of you. And so their bias, we find ourselves, I'm trying to figure out how to really, we find ourselves in an era right now that if you cannot speak up as a woman of color about the bias you're experiencing, then you won't ever be able to. And so I always like to nicely call people out nicely on things that I'm seeing. I think now more than ever, I don't think people come into the workplace, and now even though we're remote working, come on Zoom or any of the platforms to be mean or to be biased, but it does happen because bias is like the air we breathe. And so I think as a woman of color, you have to show up ready to perform, ready to do your work. You know, I always say, I never gave them one excuse to say I wasn't doing my work. And so I know that sounds like a little lecturing teacher, but make sure your stuff is tight. So when you go in there, you can go in there and say, you know what? I did all of this and I would like to know why I didn't get it. And then you say, what do I have to do to get it? And if they give you a list and you accomplish the list and you still didn't get it, you remind them that this is what you said and this is what I did. And so you have to hold people accountable, because I always say to them, they are open, some people, that you won't ask them a question when you didn't get the promotion or you didn't get that raise or you didn't get that plump assignment. And they're like, oh, let's give it to this person because we're more comfortable with them. And they're hoping, Lauren, that you will never ask. Ask the question. You don't ask, you don't get.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love that part about holding others accountable, but holding yourself accountable as well, I think is super important. Absolutely. Another question here, kind of continuing on a lot of themes that have been very, very popular, particularly over the last year or so. How do you incorporate self-care into your practices?
Oh, that's a big one for me. I think as I talked about my, you know, my intersectionality, I'm a Christian. And so I have learned over the years that if I'm not good, nobody's good. And so you have to have a practice somewhere where you can center yourself before you, I always say before you walk into the office, but most of us are not walking into the office. We're walking into Zoom land or, you know, Team land or WebEx. And so I have a practice in the morning and I get up and I go on a prayer call every single morning for 15 minutes and then for, you know, for an hour total. And that's where I center myself self-care. And I, now that I work for myself, I block off my lunchtime. As Monique will attest to, sometimes it doesn't work, but I make sure, and I try to get into bed early. I go for walks. And it's my 6 o'clock prayer call. If my minister or first lady is listening, I'm on the prayer call, but I'm on my rowing machine. So I'm multitasking. I'm praying and I'm rowing. I'm praying and I'm biking. You have to figure out a way that you're intaking with your water. You're getting up from the Zoom decks. You get a standing desk, things that you're not sitting for 15 hours a day, 10 hours, or even 8 or 5. So a lot of different tips that work, and I meditate. So there's just a lot of things that you're doing. I do, the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion has always been a real difficult topic, now more than ever. And so as I get it, as I start my day, I have to prepare myself for this topic. And if I want to do it well, so self-care is a must.
Excellent. I love that. Definitely finding those times during the day where you can have them to yourself or to do something that you enjoy, I think is so important. So I love that. I appreciate that. A couple of other questions here. So how does one work towards really overcoming the imposter syndrome? You talked about that a little bit earlier in your presentation. And is part of this process just sort of kind of getting out of your own head? How give us some tips and tricks for really helping us to go past that?
I think part of it is getting out of your own head, but part of it also, there's a couple of pieces of it. I think as I like to tell people, you know, the more experienced you become, sometimes the more it dissipates. It never goes away. It never goes away. And so you have to get out of your own head, number one. Number two is to make sure you're always prepared and you know your stuff, because you can always say to yourself, okay, you know it. And I always talk about an incident, a time when I was at the White House with some of my executive and I had to speak about STEM, and I was just pinching myself. And then I started getting imposter syndrome and thinking that I didn't belong there. And I really had to be reminded by one of the executive that was with me that I was the most competent and eligible person to do the work. So sometimes it reminds me of a song that said, speak to yourself. You have to speak to yourself to overcome that. Be prepared and get out of your own head.
Excellent.
And you also have to have some cheerleaders on the side telling you how wonderful you are.
always, you must.
Yeah. That's my husband.
Wonderful, wonderful. Of course, sponsors and mentors, and definitely having those people around you. A couple of other great questions. How do I, as a Black woman, advocate for myself with boldness and without being identified as whining?
I think whining is in the eyes of the beholder. And I think that if you take the emotions out of it, because you don't want to get the label as the angry Black woman. So take the emotions out of it, get your facts straight. And I usually just say, I know this might seem like I'm being a pest, but I really have to ask because I won't forgive myself. I know I asked you last week, you told me to come back. As long as I don't think I'm whining, I'm asking for what I want. And so I think that you have to get to a point where you also know what you want, know what to ask for, and, don't worry about the whining. If your boss feel like you're whining and they actually say you're whining, then, one thing I would say, can you explain to me, why do you call this whining, and have a conversation about it. But I wouldn't get into my head about whining. That's okay. Just ask for what you need to ask for. And if they don't have an answer for you, ask for a timeline that you can come back. And when that time comes, go back and ask again. And if you don't get it, ask for another timeline and be resilient and relentless.
Great. Another great question from the audience. This touches back on diversity. So we know that diversity is in everyone's minds these days. How do we ensure that we see long-term results?
So I always like to say to my leaders in organizations that I work in, is this a moment for you or a movement? And I think employees have to hold their leadership accountable and make sure this is not just the moment. And so one of the tips that I've been giving all of my leaders in organization, that diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be top of mind. So on everyone's agenda item, every staff meeting, every leadership meeting, diversity needs to be at the top of number one on your agenda item, or number 5. It shouldn't be the last thing. And it should be every single staff meeting. And I think that's the way you can keep track of what you promised to do. And we got to keep them honest. So I'm asking you, is this a moment or is it a movement? And you're welcome to take it. It's not mine. A moment or a movement. Top of mind on your staff meeting agenda, and not at the end, because you and I know if it's the last thing on the agenda, we're not going to get to it. We're going to run out of time.
Absolutely. And I think those are great words to wrap today's workshop up on. Is this a moment or a movement? Jackie, thank you so much again for joining us today and for sharing with us your journey and your expertise. To our audience, thank you for tuning in today. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, same place at 11:30 a.m. for our awards program and networking sessions. Hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Monique.